Now with me, Republican Senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, of course, a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, a very busy day. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Your reaction to the resignation of Michael Flynn?
Well, I guess the first thing I want to say about General Flynn is that I served with him in Afghanistan. He's been in uniform most of his adult life, and I think he's a terrific military officer, served our country well. But apparently it got to the point of where the vice president believed that General Flynn misled him about a conversation with the Russians, which led to his demise as national security advisor. Really what I want to know is I haven't seen the transcripts. I don't know what we're talking about. What did General Flynn say to the Russian ambassador about lifting sanctions? Did he say anything at all, or is this just being spun by the media? So I think Congress needs to be informed of what actually General Flynn said to the Russian ambassador about lifting sanctions. And I want to know, did General Flynn do this by himself, or was directed by somebody to do it?
Well, and that is an important question. Do you believe at this point, Senator, that Flynn misled the White House, or do you think that he was authorized to talk sanctions with Russia before President Trump took office?
I'd have a hard time believing that General Flynn would get on the phone with the Russian ambassador and suggest that, don't worry, we will revisit this when we get to be president in terms of executive sanctions, without some understanding that the administration be sympathetic to the idea. Now, I may be wrong. Maybe he did this in a rogue fashion. Maybe General Flynn went rogue, but that's a question I need to know more. I don't know. He's a pretty strong-willed fellow. But I think most Americans have a right to know whether or not this was a General Flynn rogue maneuver, or was he basically speaking for somebody else in the White House.
Well, and that's an important point, because we're hearing reaction from Capitol Hill right now from some of your colleagues on the House side. We heard from Jason Chaffetz, who thinks that the situation is now in the past. We heard from the chairman of the House Intel Committee, who thinks that some of what you need to know, want to know, isn't knowable, because that might be protected under, executive powers. Do you think that's the case, or do you think you have the right to know?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly how much Congress can compel the White House to talk about communications between the National Security Advisor and a foreign government, but we do have allegations now coming from the media that the Department of Justice informed the White House that the National Security Advisor may be subject to blackmail by the Russians. I think that's something Congress has a right to know. So I don't know where this is going to go, but I would suggest that the administration answer a few basic questions, like, did General Flynn do this by himself? If he didn't do it by himself, who directed him to engage the Russians? Because that in of itself is not going to, maybe is not that important, but the idea that we don't know how this happened and that maybe General Flynn somehow was compromised by the Russians, I think we need to know that, quite frankly.
I mean, you're trying to investigate Russia. You're pushing an investigation into the Russian hacks into the election. We know that Marco Rubio, even before Flynn resigned, said that his conversations with the Russian ambassador should be part of any investigation. Do you want to hear from Flynn? Are you going to ask him to testify?
I don't know if we'll ask him to testify, but the first thing I want to know is, what were the conversations about? I'm having to comment on things I have no direct knowledge of. So if there are transcripts of communications between General Flynn and the Russian ambassador about waiving sanctions, that's something I want to know about, because I do think that's something that Congress should be informed of.
Kellyanne Conway this morning said that what brought Flynn down was him lying to the VP, not the actual contents of his conversation with Russia. What do you think is the bigger crime here?
Well, at the end of the day, it's, talking to Russia by the National Security Advisor is generally a privileged communication. I don't need to know.
However, this was before he had the job, before this was his job to do so.
Yeah, the idea of one president at a time really makes a lot of sense. I could imagine if the shoe were on the other foot, that if the Obama administration were reaching out to Iraq or Iran to change Bush policy before they got in office, we'd be all pretty upset. So I'm not...
To say the least, Senator.
Yeah, well, and I think rightfully so. I'm not accusing General Flynn of committing a violation of the Logan Act. Maybe it doesn't apply to people in transition who are going to take over duties. The fact that you talk with Russia before you get in office, that alone doesn't bother me. But we've got a situation now where a man had to give up his job. The Congress is very intent on not waiving current sanctions. We'd actually like to impose new sanctions. The idea that maybe the National Security Advisor was somehow compromised by the Russians is certainly within my wheelhouse as to what I want to know about, because I want to know what Russia's up to in terms of the United States political system, how they tried to compromise this last election, what kind of contacts they had with any campaigns, if any, and if somebody in the administration is subject to being blackmailed. I think that's something I'd like to know about.
That's a pretty serious charge. I mean, you now, Senator,
and there may be nothing to it. Maybe nothing to it.
But you still have a lot of questions that have not been answered.
I think if the shoe were on the other foot, we'd want to know the answers to these questions. Did General Flynn act alone?
Yeah. Did you now have, if you look just at the very recent history, you have two aides, top aides to Donald Trump, Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort before him, who have resigned their posts over ties to Russia. And we also just learning that Republican Senator Roy Blunt, he is calling, and this is how he's describing it, Senator, an exhaustive investigation into Trump's personal ties with Russia. Do you trust this president when it comes to Russia?
Our differences are well known. What I like about this president, that he hasn't been trying to hide some secret plan with Russia. He has a different view of re-engaging Putin than I do. That's an honest disagreement. He's president of the United States. I think we should punish Russia more, not less. I think Russia's trying to break the backbone of democracy everywhere.
But are you confident that Donald Trump feels the same way, punishing Russia more, not less?
No, I'm confident he doesn't. I'm confident he doesn't, and that's not a crime. That doesn't disqualify him to be president of the United States. We can have different views about foreign policy, but the one thing we can't do is allow a foreign government to interfere with the electoral process without being punished, have a foreign government potentially compromise somebody in the administration without them paying a price and Congress not knowing about it. That's different than a policy dispute.
Senator, do you think now, after all of this fallout, do you think it now makes it impossible for President Trump to even talk of lifting sanctions against Russia?
I don't know. Here's what I do know, that I would fight to my last ounce of breath here to prevent this administration or any other administration from lifting sanctions against Russia for their invasion of the Ukraine and the seizing of the Crimea and all the other things they have done since then, to include interfering in our own election. I don't think they changed the outcome, but they tried to interfere in our election. They've never been punished for that behavior. The current sanctions have nothing to do with what they tried to do in the 2016 election. They deserve to be punished, because if you don't punish Russia, you're screaming weakness to Putin. Iran and China could do the very same thing in 2020 if they get mad at Trump. So it's important that both parties come together here in a bipartisan fashion to punish Russia for trying to interfere in our elections. And if General Flynn was contacting the Russian ambassador about lifting sanctions imposed by President Obama before they took office, I want to know why he made that phone call. Did he do it by himself, or was directed by somebody else? Because it does run afoul of the one president at a time policy.
One quick clarification. When Roy Blunt says he wants to have an exhaustive investigation into Donald Trump's personal contacts with Russia and how that has played out, is that now part of the investigation that you will be conducting into Russian contacts?
Well, I don't have any evidence that the president has exhaustive contacts with Russia. I am focused on what Russia did in our election and what they're trying to do to undercut democracy all over the world.
Does this change your investigation now, this news?
I think what we need to know is the contacts between General Flynn and Russia before they took office, and whether or not there was any information the Russians had that could have compromised him, because that goes to the ability of any administration to operate.
The last time that we heard from Michael Flynn really publicly, he put Iran on notice. I know you remember that very well. He is now gone. What does that mean now for U.S. policy toward Iran? What should it mean in your view?
Well, the three people named to replace General Flynn as potential candidates by the media are all excellent in different ways. General Petraeus is one of the smartest people I've ever known. He would serve the president well. But Admiral Harward, I actually served with him in Afghanistan. He was in charge of detainee operations. I did my reserve duty under his command. He would be an outstanding choice. He understands the region very well. I think he speaks Farsi. So the idea that we'd put Iran on notice is a good thing. I supported General Flynn when he made that statement. And we need to tell Iran that if you continue to develop ballistic missiles, you're going to pay a heavy price. You're going to get sanctioned again, and keep all options on the table. So what I'd like to see the president do is get a better deal. I would suggest that the Arabs and the Iranians have the same ability to produce peaceful nuclear power, that we help the Arabs build nuclear power plants and the Iranians build nuclear power plants, but we, the Russians, the Chinese, and the United States control the fuel cycle so nobody over there can turn fuel into a bomb. To me, that's a better deal for the whole world, and I hope they'll look at that.
Senator Lindsey Graham, we're going to put you in the category of you have a lot of unanswered questions now
Yes.
after what's the resignation of Michael Flynn. You'll be asking them. Thank you, Senator, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.